Hi, welcome back. Thanks for joining us on our candidate series. We're going to get right into it tonight. Our first guest is going to be Aaron Day, a candidate who's running for governor here in New Hampshire. Thanks for joining us, Aaron. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.
Let's start by educating our audience on who Aaron Day is. How did you come to get to the point where you're running for governor of New Hampshire?
Well, it's kind of a long story, but I started out as a serial entrepreneur. So I started my first company when I was 19, and that's actually my real passion, is starting businesses, creating companies, investing, advising companies. And I started a healthcare company in 2004 that was very successful, profitable. We were in 43 states, expanding rapidly. And the company was essentially dismantled by a combination of Obamacare, Dodd-Frank, and then Attorney General Eric Holder at the time was overzealous, and I won't get into a lot of the details, but I mean, essentially had this great company dismantled. And so, you know, hell hath no fury like an entrepreneur scorned. And so that kind of began my my entry into political activism. Okay. And so I moved to New Hampshire in 2009 with my wife as part of the Free State Project. Well, I lived temporarily in Massachusetts. I wasn't there for very long. I actually grew up in Indiana and spent most of my life in Indiana. But I met my wife in Massachusetts. We moved up here. We had twins in 2010. And then I got involved in political activism, specifically trying to stop Obamacare Medicaid expansion. Yeah. And that's been a long process. So I ran the Republican Liberty Caucus for a while, formed a super PAC. Normally was in the role of backing other candidates, not being a candidate myself. And then in 2016 ran for U.S. Senate as an independent, in part as a reaction to Kelly Ayotte and the Republicans interfering with our state politics for the purpose of their own political careers in Washington, D.C. I found that to be, Republicans were overwhelmingly against Obamacare Medicaid expansion. Yeah. And literally you had John H. Sununu intervening in our speaker's race in 2014, saying, look, we need to have not Bill O'Brien, but Sean Jasper, because we need to get Kelly reelected. Well, I mean, you know, our state should be protected. Our state should be driven, you know, from the bottom up, not the top down. And so what I said is, listen, if you're going to go against financial responsibility, if you're going to go against the Republican Party platform, if you're going to go against all of these things just so that you can get reelected in Washington, D.C., then I'm going to take the getting reelected part off the table so you'll do the right thing. Yeah. So we recruited an entire slate of independent candidates, and in fact, my vote total was the margin of victory. It was the most expensive United States Senate race per capita in the history of the United States Senate. And so, but nevertheless, the Republicans still didn't change their behavior. Right. So we've had Republican control for the past couple of years, and it's been the worst legislative session since I've lived here. They've increased the size of government. They've failed on major policy issues that, you know, should be Republican issues. You know, you should pass school choice. Well, they ended up not passing school choice in favor of expanding Obamacare Medicaid expansion. That makes absolutely no sense. Yeah. And so finally I just said, listen, I can't be a part of the Republican Party and a part of this process. I can't be a part of a situation that's essentially hijacked for the purpose of promoting a political dynasty. And I've always been a libertarian kind of ideologically. Yeah. And so I decided this time around to run as a libertarian, and specifically to deal with the major issues that the state is facing, which are actually financial. We're on the brink of insolvency. And a lot of people, when you read the headlines, it's like, oh, low unemployment, things look great. But the reality is, adjusted for inflation, we've increased spending at 30 times the rate of population growth over the last 30 years. Yeah. Our pension system is underfunded to the tune of $5 billion, and the politicians on either side of the aisle aren't addressing it. They're actually making it worse. And if we don't fix those things, then we can't address any of the things internal to our state. So I've put together a contract for New Hampshire, and I've kind of outlined my priorities and my positions as to what I would do as governor.
Cool. I was reading over the contract. I've read over it a couple of times, and there were a couple of points I wanted to hit on in that. You mentioned Medicaid reform, and the first thing that stuck out to me, and I'm sure you've heard this a number of times, about your third particular point on your contract, where that you would veto any bill until the reform is complete. Yep. Honestly, you know, being a novice in the political system, it seems kind of closed-minded. I was just wondering what your rationale is behind that.
My rationale is that we have to focus on our solvency and sovereignty. And literally 30% of our entire state's budget is now based on Medicaid. So the issue here is, because a lot of people say, well, is this a pet issue? Well, whether we're solvent or not isn't really a pet issue. If we're not solvent, then we literally can't deal with any other issue.
Right.
And so we've gone in the last 30 years from almost 0% of our budget being controlled by the federal government to 30%, and at the rate we're expanding, going to 50%. But it's also not closed-minded in the sense that what I'm doing, which I haven't seen any candidate do, is I'm actually putting out a contract and I'm telling you what I'm going to do up front first.
Right.
If I get a mandate, if I win as a libertarian candidate, then I suspect that mandate will be listened to by the legislature. So I don't expect that if I get elected after having presented this contract with New Hampshire, I'm not anticipating that the repeal of Medicaid expansion will fail because I will have been given that directly by the people. But Medicaid is not only 30% of our budget, but it has interfered with all aspects of our healthcare system. So Medicaid isn't just about, people say, well, Medicaid is money for healthcare for the poor. That's not even true. Our politicians in New Hampshire for 30 years have been stealing money from Medicaid and using it for the general fund. This goes all the way back to 1991. So if we want to be solvent and if we want to not be dependent upon the federal government, we have to repeal this piece of legislation.
Right. I absolutely hear that. My concern would be, like I was talking with Kim Rice the other day, she was, we were talking about SB 236, which is a shared parenting law bill that was tabled last year. And, if that bill passed through the House and the Senate and got to your desk, you would, and that's something that's very passionate to me, I'm very passionate about. You would veto that until the reform was done in the
Well, yes, because
Medicaid
I'm
system.
saying we do this first. I'm saying right out of the gates. I'm specifying this up front because, again, SB 236, fine, it's a great bill. But if we're insolvent, let's talk about what it means if we're insolvent.
Okay.
If we're insolvent, it means the cost of debt goes up. It means that the economy is crushed. It means that they're going to implement an income tax and a sales tax, which is going to crush business. It means that so while that's an important bill, if we don't fundamentally fix our solvency issue, great. If you pass that bill but we're insolvent, how's that going to work?
I get you.
And again, and I would say, and I know Kimberly, and I know that her heart is in the right place, but we just had 2 years of complete Republican majorities, and they accomplished nothing. Nothing on a major policy issue with respect to school choice, with respect to the budget, with respect to right to work. They failed on every major policy objective when they had a complete run of the board. And so, and we know why. It's because people want to move up the ladder. People have eyes on Washington, D.C., and this is what's controlling the policy in our state. So I'm saying, guys, we have to deal with this issue. If we don't deal with this issue, we have a solvency problem.
Okay.
We have a sovereignty problem, and I'm going to ask for a mandate from the people up front. And this is something that we can address very quickly. You know what I mean? This can be done right away. The repeal of Medicaid expansion, it need not be pushed off. It's not like, again, I don't expect to be vetoing a lot of bills. I expect that if I get elected with this mandate that we will repeal Medicaid expansion.
Okay.
The other thing that I'll say is, with the way Medicaid expansion has been handled since 2013, I don't know if you know this, but every time they've passed it, what the politicians have said is, well, we're going to pass. So here's the big controversy with Medicaid. The federal government said, because it's part of Obamacare, but it's optional, and it's at the discretion of the state. But the way that it was structured is the federal government will initially pay for 100% of the expansion, but that will taper down to 90% over time. And so what our politicians said, what the Republicans said in 2013 is, the taxpayers of New Hampshire will never have to pay a dime for this. So they engineered a scheme to try to get these waivers from the federal government. And they came up with a scheme where instead of Medicaid coming from the federal government to the state to be dispersed, the money goes from the federal government to private insurers who will then manage Medicaid. Then to cover that difference between the 90% and the 100% reimbursement, they were going to tax the insurers and tax the hospitals. Well, here's the thing. HHS came in and said, that's illegal. We're going to cut all of your funding. So one thing that I would argue to about this point is the Medicaid expansion we put in place to date isn't legal. So repealing something that's not even that's not even sound shouldn't be a difficult proposition.
Okay, cool. That kind of leads me to my next point. I wanted to talk about state funding. I was talking with a woman, Jane Cormier, who was running for the executive council, and she informed me something I was unaware of, that all federal funding that comes into the state should be assessed and directed through the executive council, and that's not the case right now with what's going on. That being said, what I wanted to, the specific issue I wanted to get into was when the federal funding comes into the state, specifically, and I want to get into Title IV. I don't know what you know about Title IV Parts D and E specifically, but the funding that's provided by the federal government through our Social Security Act in Title IV D and E is focused on giving family law, family court, and DCYF and all the alphabet soup agencies what they call, and it's literally in quotes, special incentive to the family law, the court, to collect child support arrearage, which, it was written in 1997 by Hillary Clinton during her Takes a Village tour. And I hate to use the word honest and Hillary Clinton in the same sentence, but I do believe there was an honest intention on her part to make sure that the custodial parent had the means they needed to take care of the family. The problem with that is what it took away from the non-custodial parent. The way that the child support is handled is just so wrong, we'll put it that way. And the funding that's coming in to incentivize judges, agencies to basically separate families, destroy families, is wrong. And one thing that I hope to work on in the next couple of years with the legislature is redirecting that fund. Instead of sending it to family court, put it into education, healthcare reform, so forth. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, that or give it back to the taxpayer.
That's part of your contract is paying back the taxpayer.
Well, it is paying back. We are $22 trillion in debt. We have $100 trillion of unfunded liabilities. And one of the things that does drive me nuts when it comes to even looking at these issues, people will say, well, the Medicaid money, it's free money. None of it's free. It's money that our kids have to pay. Right. In fact, we've gone beyond, Margaret Thatcher said, the problem with socialism is sooner or later you run out of other people's money. Mm-hmm. But what our politicians have figured out how to do is how to borrow from future generations. So it's even worse than that.
Right.
Talk about a country, kind of built on this whole idea of, fighting the idea of, taxation without representation. Well, what do we do about the fact that literally the money now that's being voted on, for the most part, isn't even coming from the taxpayers themselves. It's added on as debt. So I would be in favor of giving that money back to the taxpayers, but also getting the state out of, the state has not proven to be effective, whether it's with DCYF or family courts at all. And you're right, the incentives are lined up completely inappropriately. And I have been to a number of hearings in family court. I've filmed various court hearings for people that have been dealing with the family court system. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, a subset of the family law committee in 2015 or 16 filed a complaint with the U.S. Attorney's Office regarding what was going on here in New Hampshire, because even legislatively, the amount of discretion that judges have in family court is something that they really couldn't even deal with that much within the family law committee. So we got to the point where, is this now a criminal issue?
Yeah.
And do we need to get the federal government involved to actually monitor what's going on? And there was significant support. I believe there were 5 or 6 reps on that committee that signed that letter to the U.S. Attorney General's office.
Yeah, I know, I heard recently, I haven't seen any information on it, but I know Kevin Avard, Senator here in New Hampshire, created a committee to assess or investigate family law and parental alienation in general. Are you aware of any of Kevin's work?
I'm aware of Kevin's work historically. I know we had the redress of grievances committee that despite its intention, my understanding is didn't accomplish anything. Okay. And in fact, this is a thing that I will say, one thing I don't want to do, because I have been to hearings, and I've talked to a lot of people that are dealing with parental alienation. I mean, it's like, you're talking about separating fathers and mothers from their kids. There's no more sensitive issue. And I've seen a lot of politicians give false hope around this. And that's been kind of devastating, and not necessarily maliciously. I think in a lot of cases, there's really good intent. I mean, there's the intent to say, yeah, well, we're going to go in and fix this. And then what you realize is, for instance, as governor, well, it's really the head of HHS that's kind of overseeing this whole thing. This person has a term that's outside of I didn't appoint him, and I can't get rid of him as governor. And then, and it's not like government employees. I mean, I'm an entrepreneur, so I'm used to starting companies from scratch. You hire employees at will. You can't just go in and say, I'm going to clean house and fire all these employees. You have to deal with all of their contracts and everything else, which is why my big viewpoint is, get the government. Let's look for private solutions. Let's look for anything to get the government out of it, because the incentives are wrong. And even if I came in and I fixed something and I said, well, I'm going to tweak this and make it run better, the one thing they've got to realize is, well, 2 years, 4 years down the line, my political opponent might be running this, and what are they going to do with it?
Right.
And government bureaucracy has a tendency to only go in one direction. I mean, we essentially have a fourth branch of government. Some of these government agencies run with their own set of rules, with their own procedures, and outside of a place where there's any real oversight.
Without the use of the Constitution.
And without, well, particularly with the DCY, with those judges.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I hate to call myself a victim, but I am a victim of family law. And they don't adhere to the 6th or the 14th Amendment. And I could get into this, we could do a 2-hour show on just the corruption in family law, but I want to get more into your contract and your outlook.
Well, the only thing I would say about this is again, I would appoint better judges, and to the extent that I can, which I can't even with the head of HHS, I would try to appoint better people. But the thing that I've seen that can be done is when citizens act together. And so I'm from Bedford. And so we recently had this issue. I don't know if you've seen this in the news about the school counselor who was convicted of raping a child.
Right.
And this person was previously in the Bedford system for 5 years, was the head of the school counselors, then went to Exeter, and then was found guilty of this. And I think 3 existing counselors from Bedford, spoke on behalf of that counselor at sentencing. The superintendent, I guess, allowed it or whatever. And this is one of those situations where the parents were outraged, and rightfully so. This is not an okay situation. But the school board would have done nothing about it. I mean, this is kind of like, if you've ever noticed this, if you get arrested, it's plastered all over the TV.
Right.
But if a police officer does something wrong, you find out 6 months later that they engaged in unspecified bad conduct, and it's being dealt with as a personnel review.
Yeah.
Well, that's Article 8 of the Constitution. I mean, they work for us. And yet we actually have a completely different set of transparency with respect to activities. So where I'm going with this is, the parents were outraged. So the school board wasn't going to act. But the actual outrage and the momentum and everything else, the superintendent has resigned. And now I suspect those 3 other counselors will resign, not because of school board action, because they'll say our hands are tied, it's this employment agreement, we can't do this, we can't do this. I think those parents will continue to put up pressure. And eventually the counselors will just decide, look, it's not worth staying here. And my point on that is, that's what needs to happen with family law. Exactly. More than anything I can do for governor, when you look at, why don't we have Yelp for judges, for lawyers, for police?
Right.
I mean, isn't that interesting? I mean, we have this Lori's List situation where it's like, well, here's all of this. It's redacted. The names are redacted.
Right.
Corrupt government officials, if their corruption is pointed out and it's public, that is, in my opinion, the only backstop we have to correct any problems. And so this isn't. I'm suggesting that as citizens we do this. It's not something and that happened regardless of whether I'm governor or not. That is the real final backstop that we have.
Well, yeah, I think that's what our forefathers laid out in the Constitution. It's our responsibility to make sure that the Constitution is upheld, and as we, the people, grow more ignorant of the process, it makes it more difficult for the process to run properly. And that's why I'm doing this now, and we're parading the state, talking to people, trying to get everyone out to vote, because it's vital that we, the people, put the right people in place and not rely on mainstream media to endorse, Chris Sununu or whoever's his opponent of the day is, Mark Kelly or whoever. It's important to get people like you, yourself, Diletta, others who are running that don't have the exposure, get that information out there and let them know the things that are really happening. Because I'm not hearing what you're saying to me from mainstream media, and I really appreciate your transparency.
Well, you're not going to hear, and by the way, on the issue on the Medicaid thing, I've written several articles where I've outlined what's gone on over the last 30 years. So this isn't like I said, this isn't a pet project or a small issue. If we don't deal with this, literally, we won't have control over our own state. I mean, we're approaching that point of 50% of our funding, on the pathway of 50% of our funding coming from Washington, D.C., at which point they can determine. I mean, if you look at what's going on with Europe, with Greece, and the whole situation with the EU, well, do we want to be bailing out California? Do we want to be bailing out Illinois? Or do we want to protect our own solvency? And so in order to do that, we need to stop giving up control of our entire healthcare system and major components of our budget to Medicaid for the purpose of helping political dynasties remain in power and become Washington lobbyists after serving in Washington, D.C. for a few years.
Yeah. I look back and I look at the country overall, and I see that back in the 80s, Reagan got everything back on track for the most part. And then in the 90s, I really feel that that we, the people, the citizens of America, just kind of took it easy at that point and let the politicians run the show. And that's when Title IV was written, D and other acts and laws that really contradict what I know to be the Constitution. But anyways, I regress.
Well, this is the point on something like Medicaid. I mean, imagine if you could go back and stop Title 4D.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in my opinion, that's it's important when you never get rid of entitlement program. Never. So this is a one-time opportunity to get rid of the expansion of entitlement program.
Right.
And when you consider that the bulk of our budget now, I believe 2/3 of our budget, are these entitlement programs. This is what's bankrupting the country. This is why we're with this great economy and low unemployment. Why do we have a $1.1 trillion deficit?
Right.
It's these programs. And the thing is, if you look throughout history, if you look through 6,000 years, there's an economist, Martin Armstrong, who did this. He actually is a fascinating guy, but he would study coins, and he hired 250 people to study both the debasement of coins over time and also currency prices. And it's the same thing that goes on over time in different civilizations and different societies. You have a government that's in place. You end up implementing kind of the bread and circus approach where the politicians want to, basically buy off the populace. And then one of two things happens. You either hit a financial crisis or you go to war to take other people's resources. This is what happens throughout history. We're not changing that program here, and we are on a collision course. This is why you're seeing trade wars and everything else happen. I mean, we shouldn't be in a position where we have trade wars in the 21st century, and yet we are, and it's because countries have been fiscally irresponsible across the board with respect to these entitlement programs, and no one wants to, and no one is willing to take it head on, and I'm willing to take it head on.
I appreciate that.
And when you see this contract, I mean, look, if I win or lose this time, I'm going to continue pushing this contract because we will have to deal with these issues. And I think it was Churchill that said, well, the Americans you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing when they've exhausted all of the other options. And that very well may be what happens here. But I'm going to push. I'm running because this has to happen. I'm running because I have 8-year-old twins. And we're at a point right now where, despite the fact that we spend $1 out of every $5 on healthcare, we've had 2 years of declining life expectancy. We're at a point where our kids are going to have a lower life expectancy and lower quality of life unless we fix these fundamental issues.
Yeah, I agree. I agree wholeheartedly, and it's our responsibility as the adults to make sure that tomorrow is better for our children. Yep. One last thing I wanted to talk to you about, the last thing you say in your contract is that once that, as long as these issues are accomplished during your term, you won't run for re-election.
Yeah.
What is your standing on term limit?
I don't know whether they should be there legally, but I mean, I think if you go back to what George Washington didn't have, and he did the right thing and backed down. And then FDR, went overboard, and we're dealing with a lot of those things right now. Title 4D is part of Social Security, which is an FDR program, and so that's when we put in the term limit. I'm not opposed. I mean, I'm open to the idea, but I mean, I think I'd rather lead by example and do what I'm doing and say, look, if I accomplish these things, I'm not going to run again. And maybe if we can get more citizens to step forward. Politics isn't meant to be a career. This shouldn't be a career. I have no interest in being a career. No one should be interested in being a career politician. You should just be willing to do your part to protect the future for the country moving forward. And so, maybe if I term limit myself, maybe that starts a trend, and maybe people just start voluntarily doing it without the need. I don't know how much of a problem it is here. Interestingly, in most states, the governor is like the top position. So people will go to Washington, D.C., and then they'll go back to their home state to run for governor. We have a very weak governor. And as I've mentioned before, I mean, we have this executive council that's supposed to approve transactions over $5,000. Any appointments have to be approved by the executive council. I mean, you really have veto power, but that's the extent of it.
Yeah.
And in most other states, it's a completely different phenomenon. So people use the governor's office as a springboard to get to Washington, D.C. So I don't even know if term limits are an issue for governor, but if you look at the state house, the average age of a state rep is 67. And one of the things that bothers me, I mean, I know a lot of conservatives and liberty people that have been running for state rep or maybe our state rep, but if you're married, if you work, you have kids, you can't continue to stay in the house to get into a leadership position. You can't be there for 10 years. You have other obligations, which is why I'd be more interested in seeing, and they can do this, they can change the rules. Why doesn't the House meet, after hours, or maybe even in some cases on the weekends? They open it up so that you can have a broader base of people that can participate in government, because otherwise, I mean, there are people that have been there for decades, and I mean, it's really problematic. On the family law thing, I know somebody who I believe was the chair also served as, is my understanding, working on obtaining some of this Title 4D money on a private basis. And the thing that I'd say about Concord is, if you have a conflict, as long as you disclose it, it's okay. Right. So which, is kind of bizarre. But I mean, we saw this with Medicare, with Medicaid expansion. The prime sponsor in the House was a guy who was on the board of the Elliott Hospital. We've seen this with every case of this. You see this element of cronyism, and just as long as they disclose they have the conflict, it moves forward.
Right. Yeah. It's sad. It's a sad state, and it doesn't need to be changed. And that's why this election is so very vital to our country, not just here in Derry and in New Hampshire, but throughout the country. There's all kinds of problems going on. I know in Michigan just recently, the HHS head got ousted because he knew about the water issue in Flint and didn't say anything. So the people are standing up more and becoming more, holding our politicians more accountable, which is a good thing, but it's just far too small a scale right now.
Did you see what happened in West Virginia?
No.
The House in West Virginia voted to impeach every Supreme Court justice.
Oh, I saw that. Yeah, I meant to call a friend of mine down there, Senator Ojeda. I was talking with him over the summer, and I saw that. Yeah, you posted that on social media, and I remember looking at that, and I was, wow, cool. That's about time.
So the Senate still has to approve it, but boy, I looked at that, and when you look at it, and I guess they spent millions of dollars redecorating their offices or whatever it is. But boy, wouldn't that be something? It would be nice. Judges don't really feel they're immune to really any pressure, right? They're appointed here. They're appointed for life. What check and balance is there on the judiciary? Really?
Right.
So
that's where we need to clean this up. Absolutely. Aaron, I can't thank you enough. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you.
Thank you for having me.
Good luck in your run. We'll be pulling for you in November.
September
11th. Remember, September 11th in New Hampshire. Get out to vote. If you're not registered, go down to your town clerk. Bring proof of residency, citizenship, and identity, and sign up and become a part of the solution. If you don't get a chance before the primary to do that, you can register at the poll. So get active, be a part of the solution. That's what we're aiming for. Thanks again, Aaron. We're gonna move on with the show now. I'm gonna introduce our next guest, and in just a minute, I want to talk a little bit about what's going on right now. In talking with Aaron, I mentioned a few people that I spoke to this weekend, and I want to give a large thank you to Jane Cormier and Gilletta Jarvis for making Saturday a spectacular day. The events that were held were fantastic, and the conversation amongst the candidates is just absolutely phenomenal. We're going to, I think we're going to take a break right now, and then we'll bring in our next guest. So stay tuned. Okay, welcome back, folks. Here we are doing our campaign candidate series with the candidates running for election in November. We got a busy show today, so I just want to get right into it. My next guest is going to be a good friend of mine. I've known David for over a quarter of a century, and he's a good man. The one word that I use to describe David is integrity. Dave, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, TJ.
Appreciate you coming on.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to ask you to start off by just letting people know who you are. Who is David Love, and how did you get to the point where you're running for elected office?
Well, I'm a 64-year-old dad. And I say dad because it's the most important job I've ever been given in my life. And I got involved in politics. I've always been interested in it, even as a little kid. But I got involved in it with father's rights things when I was getting divorced, and testified a few times in Concord, and then I just became more interested in other things, and the whole thing just rolled.
Okay, awesome. Some of the other things that you've gotten involved in, I know you're very active with the Second Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give us a little idea of your philosophy on the Second Amendment?
My philosophy on the Second Amendment is there's a dot after the word infringe. That dot, when I learned in the second grade, was period,
mm-hmm.
and it meant end of statement. In fact, the very next words in the Constitution are the Third Amendment. And, the Second Amendment's under attack today. There's been some horrific things that have gone on, and, we've got to look at the whys as to why this has happened. Why has it happened in the last, 20, 30 years, and it hadn't happened before.
Mm-hmm.
People had guns then, too.
Right.
And, there's, the fatherless homes,
mm-hmm.
The psych drugs, the complete and utter failure of law enforcement. So often they've been informed about these people. The kid down in Florida, I understand the police were at his home 39 times. Twice he had a gun to his mother's head.
Yeah.
And because of Obama's Promise program, nothing was ever done. We left the discipline up to the school principal. And, that's insanity.
Yeah. Yeah, you're talking about the Parkland incident.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's ironic that there, of all these school shootings and mass shootings, I think it was like 83% of the perpetrators came from broken homes.
36 out of 37.
Yeah, so a little bit higher than 83%. Yeah. So I think the destruction of the family is far more important than the Second Amendment, as far as the dysfunction in the country is concerned. Taking that to the next step, a big part of the destruction of the family is the education system throughout the country, specifically here in New Hampshire. I know you have some very passionate, strong views on Common Core and the dysfunction that it creates, and how the way our children are being taught today, as opposed to when we were kids. Being taught the period means stop. Nowadays the curriculum is far different than that. Can you give our audience an idea of what that's about, Common Core?
As I go out knocking on doors and meeting people, I hear from parents all the time how their kids are sitting at the kitchen table at 9 o'clock at night crying because they can't figure out, this math or what have you. And the parents are you know, they can't help. They don't understand it themselves.
Right.
You know, I don't know what the motivation is. I have my ideas, but you know, I can't prove anything, so I won't say it. But you know, the fact of the matter is, Common Core is failing a lot of kids. I have a friend who has a grandson going into the 5th grade, and because of Common Core math taking so much time, reading's taking a back seat, and this kid reads at a less than first grade level.
Crazy.
He reads words like dog and man. Child is tough. You know, he can sit there and try to figure that one out. You know, you give him a double syllable word, and he's it's impossible.
Lost.
And you know, and they've kept promoting him and promoting him, in order to get federal dollars. And you know, we've got to get the federal dollars out of the picture.
Yeah.
You know,
and like our first guest Aaron was saying, that's the key. You know, decreasing the size of government. You've been active in dairy politics for quite some time.
Just as a rep and you know, running my mouth whenever I see something wrong.
Which is how it works.
Sure.
You know, that's the best thing you can do. And you talked about going and knocking on doors. You seem to have a campaign that is way old school compared to what I'm seeing with other candidates, and I appreciate that. And I guess my question would be, what is your purpose? What is your purpose for doing this?
My purpose, once again, like I said, I'm a dad, and I want a New Hampshire like you know, with the freedoms that I enjoyed. Of course, I was brought up in Massachusetts, and I escaped there about 30 years ago. But you know, I want a New Hampshire advantage left to my daughter, you know, and future grandchildren.
Yeah.
And you know, I don't see that happening. You know, our financial compass is lost. Our moral compass is on its way. You know, and that's pretty much my purpose. To be a 1 in 400 vote to try to stop that.
Okay. Good. Now, you and I did a couple of things on Saturday. Thank you. And again, that was, I mean, it was absolutely fantastic that whole day, you know, from waving signs on the corner to repairing signs for Jane Cormier. Do you have any future events coming up, mainly before the primary?
I've just been doing, you know, sign waves and what have you, sign waves and knocking on doors. I've been trying to put together a meet and greet, but I'm getting a little resistance from the people that I was going to do it with, as far as the timing of it getting a little late.
Yeah.
You know, but you know, we do our sign wave down at the dump. I was talking to Ann Kopp. She's doing a write-in campaign, and maybe we're going to buy some coffee and set up a table and see if people come in and talk to us there, and you know, things like that. You know, it's a grassroots thing. You know, name recognition is a lot.
Oh yeah.
And,
I've heard so many positive reviews of you just because your last name is Love. You know, and with us being Love Works, it seems you know, you should be here on a regular basis.
Trust me, I've made some enemies. You know, and if you haven't made enemies, it means you've never stood for anything.
That's right.
And I do stand for things. And you know,
you're very passionate about what you do, and I appreciate that greatly. And you haven't changed. I mean, we met back in the 90s, and you're the same man now you were back. And that speaks more to me than anything that's coming out of your mouth. You know? Now, excuse me. The election the primary is the 11th. So we've got 2 weeks left. And I guess what I want to ask you lastly is, because we've only got a few minutes left, I want to wrap this up. But what's the one question I haven't asked you? What's the one thing you want to talk about that I haven't brought up?
I'm giving that much thought. I guess, you know, like we were talking earlier, is you know, Aaron had his contract with New Hampshire, and I've got an idea of a contract for dairy. You know, whenever I consider any legislation, it'll have to pass this muster. Is it constitutional? Is it necessary? How much will it cost? Is it that necessary? Can we do better?
Nice.
And how will it affect the citizens of Derry? And you know, if everything can pass that criteria, it'll get a yes vote from me. Otherwise, you know, the nonsense of you know, compromising beyond what's sensible has to stop.
Right. Maintaining your principles.
That's it. You
Yeah.
know, you know, I guess that's one thing you can say is I'm principled.
Yes,
And,
absolutely.
you know,
I absolutely hear that, and
Mhm.
I'm really excited about the upcoming election, especially with you. You've been such a good friend for so long, and I'm so when you first announced that you were going to be running, I mean, I was through the roof with joy
yeah,
because
mhm.
knowing you as I do.
Mhm.
So I can't thank you enough. I really want to. I want to invite you back anytime. You're more than
Alright,
welcome
sure.
to come on the show,
Mhm.
especially after you win your primary election. We'll have you back in.
Okay,
And
cool.
but there's just not enough words to sum up how I feel about you, Dave. You're a good man, and
Thanks.
I'm glad you're a part of my life. Thank you so
Same here.
very much.
Thank you,
All
TJ.
right. I'm gonna wrap this up now. It's been an extremely educational day for me. I hope that you were all able to learn something about Aaron Day and Dave Love today. Two good men who have a cause and have a purpose and are up for election on September 11th. Make sure you register to vote, get out there, be active, and be a part of the solution. Okay, that's what we're shooting for here in Derry and throughout New Hampshire, and from what I've seen around the country. And so there are some great people doing some great things to get the word out there. So let's keep pushing forward and make the difference for our children, so that tomorrow's generation won't have to suffer the way we did and our children are suffering now. Thanks again for joining us. I look forward to seeing you all again on our next show. We'll be taping again in a couple of weeks on primary day, in fact. Be sure to join us. But special guest Chris Mader will be in studio, so mark that on your calendar. And I hope everyone has a great day, and we won't be talking to you again pre-primary, so make sure you get out there. Get out there and vote. And if you don't know how, go to your town clerk. They can tell you. Okay? Have a great election season, everyone, and we'll talk to you real soon. And the best way to sum it up is just as, it's all about love. We need to get the love out there. It's not there. We need to start the love from the bottom and work it up because the hate's coming from the top. So I'd like to thank, like I said, Aaron and David and all of you for joining us. So have a great day, everyone, and remember, love is just a word until you give it meaning. Thank you all so much for joining us, and be sure to be here next time. Good night, Andrea.